My Vo2 Max is 57 now. This message became clear this morning after I did my run, and I finished the run 2 hours ago, and so it showed to me 57. So I last week already hoped that it would increase to 57. It actually is not fully 57 yet, as you might see, but Garmin rounds it up, it seems, from 0.5 on or from 0.6 on. Now this graph here is also only available on the watch itself, so the incline of the progress, or the incline of the graph rather, not of the progress, is visible only on the watch. So this is the reason I showed it to you here. Now we also might jump into Garmin Connect, and I actually can show you how it increased over time. So this is now, when I first got the Garmin watch, it was only 51 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Now what I actually thought it is that it was 53, and that's also what I mentioned in multiple videos now already, but it seems that this was not so much the case, that it was only 51. Now I did have a Vo2 Max of 52 once in Samsung Health, and this was not the last April 2023, but this was already in I think October 2022. So now more than, well, it's 1.5 years ago, I would say. Now this here, 51, is actually then not entirely true. So it's not that it is not entirely true, it is just that I said now multiple times that I increased my Vo2 Max from 53 to 56. So up until this morning it was 56, and this was then not true at all, because it actually dropped down to 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute even. So what I actually did within the last year, as it turns out now of course we have to still wait for April, but this is only the last year. So let's actually take a look back. Okay, I was right, it was 53, and then for some reason it dropped in not in March, but then it dropped in the next month, and it dropped to 51 and then to 50. I don't know why specifically this would be the case. There could be multiple reasons for this. One would be that I am less adapted to the heat, basically. So as in April and in March the temperatures begin to rise, heat adaptation begins to so heat adaptation basically has to build up, but it only builds up apparently if you train a lot, at least in Garmin, it says if you train more than 22 degrees Celsius, or in an environment that is hotter than 22 degrees Celsius. Now, also, there is, up to a certain point, so there is, I think, an ideal zone in which you train optimally, or perform optimally. I think it's in between 12 degrees Celsius and, I don't know, 18 degrees Celsius, something like this. And so this might also be a reason that I just am able in winter to basically dress as light as I possibly can to not sweat, and so to maximize my performance. And then, and then in summer, once summer kicks in, it takes a little bit of time maybe until heat adaptation occurs, and then in winter my Vo2 Max seems to increase a little bit more. Now it actually already increased in the last months, so it was only 54 in last October, then it was 55 in November, then it was in December still 55, then 55 still in January, and it went to 56 in February. Now there is a big change actually that I made from January to February. And so now there are of course many variables, and I cannot really tease out what of these variables had a big effect on my Vo2 Max. But if we take a look at this year, at 55 to 56 within 1 month, whereas previously it's basically stagnated for 3 months, or it just increased at a third of the pace rather, or just simplified, but then it again increased by 1. So currently it seems, at least within the last 2 months, that my Vo2 Max increases by 1 milliliter per kilogram per minute, which seems to be useful, I would say. So I didn't want to say it is great or something like this, because I try to be as neutral as possible. So now it is at 57, and I now want to mention the first variable. The first variable is that I began taking creatine back in March or February last year. So this could also be why it then increased from May on. Maybe there was an accumulating effect, because in the beginning I only took 1.25 grams of creatine, and then 2.5, and then I think anywhere in April from May I actually began to increase it to 5 grams, and then I think somewhere in June or July I actually increased to 10 grams. Then I I did have to stop, and I did have to stop around September, where I then had to decrease my creatine intake. I decreased it to 5 and 2.5 grams. Sometimes I didn't take it at all because I had a medical issue. And this would then be somewhat in line. Of course, it still does increase. So I actually did not. So the medical issue arose in late August. I then didn't change anything, even though my doctors advised me to basically reduce all my supplements to 0. And then in September and October, I probably was still taking creatine, and then I stopped it. And I stopped it for basically these 3 months, for November, December, and January, or had to reduce it mostly. And within these months, I basically stagnated in terms of this. Now, I also have had a stagnation in multiple other areas, and this is not now the right cam. Let's switch back to the main cam. That is actually me, so I disabled a notebook. I also noticed this change, in a similar change with these VO2. Now, of course, this is only one data point, and I also have to mention that Garmin only estimates your Vo2 Max, or at least mine, whenever I run. I do only now run on a weekly basis, which means I have one run, which then determines my Vo2 Max for this week, which is then not even an average because it's only one data point. Now, in order for Garmin to estimate your Vo2 Max, and this is similar on other fitness trackers, you have to run on a flat surface for a certain distance, and this is usually met, this criteria, when I run on a Sunday. So that's basically usually anywhere from 5 to 15 kilometers. At least it used to be 15 kilometers in the last couple of months. So I had a few runs where I would be able to run more, but I reduced it mostly because there seems to be a limitation in mostly my calves. So my calves seem to not be able to carry myself through at least a higher speed, or whatever the limitation is. But for a given run, I am not able to basically have the strength in my calves for all of the run, and these seem to be the limitation. For example, today I was not able to break through zone 3, which I sometimes am, but today I was not. So I also train usually fasted, and I also run usually fasted, which also might be a reason for a lower zone training or a lower zone result than it seems to be the case, at least in my eyes or in my experience, that if I eat something before that, my body temperature is higher, but also if there are carbs in it, I'm able to cardiovascularly perform a little bit better. Now, this might be different with strength training, even though with strength training the effect seems to be the same, but the body temperature seems then to be higher, which in terms of a run, for example, if the environment is a limiting factor then, so if it's too warm, and I cannot properly cool myself, so I usually try to run as cool as possible. This could mean in winter that in the beginning of the run I actually am freezing. And today, for example, it had 5 degrees Celsius as I got out, and I ran in a tank top and shorts, also in order to basically do a little bit of cold exposure, but also in order to decrease my core temperature, or rather my body temperature, up to the point where I would perform as good as I possibly can. I also noticed, for example, that once I switched my tank top, because I lost the last 2 tank tops for training in the gym, so I'm switching them out every now and then, or I had to switch them out because I lost these, or they were stolen, I don't know exactly. Now I switched these out to 2 different ones, and they are a little bit of a thicker material, and this thicker material seems to have a negative effect on how well I am able to perform, so basically limiting my average performance probably, but also my peak performance, because I'm running hotter in the gym. The gym is usually, I think, at a given temperature. This could probably be 20 degrees Celsius, maybe it's 18 degrees, maybe it's 21 degrees. Probably it's not 21, because I would notice probably a little bit more if it was this warm, because 21 degrees is already quite warm. But so much about this mostly. No. So my Vo2 Max seems to also respond to training quite well. This might not be the case for different individuals, and so this might also, I have read, I didn't read, I just looked, basically I overflew, you could say, but I don't know if this is a word, so I skimmed is the right word. I skimmed, I think, a study recently where they compared different gene types, not gene types, but different types of genes and different basically sets of genes, and it seems to be that some people respond to basically have a system that is more trainable in terms of now the cardiovascular ability, of which Vo2 Max seems to be a marker. Now, Rhonda Patrick also recently, so I recently saw an interview where Rhonda Patrick, who has a PhD and who also has a YouTube presence where she talks about health-related topics similar to Huberman, but also already before Huberman. And she recently mentioned on an interview on a podcast that with every 1 point increase in VO2 max, it is associated, or there's an association to 45 days of increased lifespan. Now, this seems to be quite, if I got this wrong, it could also be health span, but I think it was lifespan. Now, this seems to be something that is now, that brings it down to a very simplistic view. So, for example, if I somehow would be able to push it further, for example, Insight Tracker recently recommended that I start taking ashwagandha. Not recently, but actually already with the last blood draw and that I had in December. It recommended that I start taking a few different things like ALA, which I haven't quite found online. Then I also don't know what it stands for, but it seems to be some kind of fatty acid, I think. Then it also recommended that I it also now recommended that I keep a dose of curcumin, which is 500 milligrams, curcumin is the extract of turmeric, as I understand it. And so I already am taking 575 milligrams. I just didn't hit the threshold of 500 because the pills I got are actually, it's not pills, but rather capsules, where there is the powder. Now, what I wanted to mention is that ashwagandha, as I 2 days ago read through the description on Insight Tracker, seems to be somewhat correlated with, or somewhat correlated with increasing VO2 max if you take it. Now, this would be basically maybe an additional variable I could introduce, or I could up basically, that then maybe would give me a better or more increase in my VO2 max, even though I don't specifically now. It's not that I don't specifically train for VO2 max, I just train, basically, I already have a set workout plan. And I also want to describe this now very briefly, or rather briefly compared to the other videos where I talk about them, where I talk my plan for 2 hours. But I want to mention this briefly also to maybe hold this. Basically, it's now increasing. And whatever I'm doing, it seems to be working. Now, it could be increasing a little bit more, but I don't want to change too much in my training. Or probably I shouldn't change anything at all, because it seems to be working. As long as I can basically hold up this progress, which seems to be currently at least every 3 months, I get an increase of VO2 max of 1 point. And I'm now with 57 already approaching the VO2 max of Brian Johnson, for example, who gave me, I have to say, a practical example of what one could achieve also already. And he is almost 20 years older than me, and he still has a VO2 max at this point in time that is higher than mine. I think his last measurement was in between 58 and 59. Now, I also have to mention here that this only is an estimate on my side. I don't have my VO2 max properly measured, but it's only an estimate. So it's only kind of Garmin saying, okay, with these metrics, such as your pulse for this distance and your average paces and the elevation you did, you probably have a VO2 max of someone, or you probably are similar to someone with a measured VO2 max of 57. So, and also my VO2 max actually is more close to 56.5, but Garmin already now shows it as 57. I also now want to maybe show you shortly or briefly the dashboard. Not so much you, but rather my future me, which is, I think, the main proxy it makes sense to target these videos to. So therefore I now go back to the main page, and here you can see now that it shows 57. What it also shows you is it is basically only in the beginning of the range that would be described as superior. Now, there might also be an additional range. I don't know if Garmin displays it, but this would be elite VO2 max. So there are these different colors, and these different colors are associated with different kinds of labels. And I now, as of the VO2 max of 56, have the label superior. Before it was, I don't know what it was before. Maybe we can access the description Garmin has here somewhere. View your fitness age. Now, currently I'm in the top 5% for my age and gender, and this is in the age group of men, 20 to 29-year-olds. Now, Garmin also has a fitness age, and also Garmin has a cycling VO2 max, which seems to be also here, but I didn't update this recently. I basically only got one measurement where I was on a smart trainer, but I don't usually have access to a smart trainer, so it was only measured once, and this seems to be also in line with the Vo2 Max I had in terms of running back then, which was also 55, but now this is 57, so the cycling Vo2 Max is probably not something I can update anytime soon. Now what I wanted to show you is, if I go back on my main page, it also shows you this circle, but I already showed you. In terms of load, I actually had a big decrease in the load Garmin shows me, and this might also be visible in this graph, which for one shows the optimal range. This here is the acute training load, which is, so there is the acute training load, and there is also the load ratio. And the load ratio, as I understand it, is basically the current load divided by the chronic load. The chronic load, I think, is for about 4 weeks, so it's at the average of the last 4 weeks. Now it disappeared again. Training status, where is the load? There is this. There was this graph you could actually access. Progress summary, Vo2 Max, HRV, acute load. So it's probably in here. But what I wanted to see is this graph where there is the optimal range, and this is this graph. So if we take a look at this graph, and this already shows quite a bit. So the heat acclimation is basically has been 0. It actually went up to almost 30–40%, where I would do a lot of sauna in summer. I also try to heat adapt basically for normal everyday life, because it is quite hot, and it also means for me that I am usually quite hot. Because if you think also about this, and this also seems to make sense, I think, if I am intaking a certain macronutrient ratio of food, then in winter there's additional calories that are basically inefficient that my body actually doesn't need. But so let's say, okay, I am eating only 1000 calories, then it will be very hard for me to get enough protein, to get enough micronutrients, so the minerals, the vitamins, and so on and so forth. But if I would be able to take now 5000 calories daily in, and I would be able to still maintain, so I would be able to still get out at 0 compared to at 1000 calories, not doing any exercise at all, but my base rate is already 1.8. So let's just assume I ate only 2000 calories. Better example, I think. If I now increased it to 3000 calories by doing extra activity every single day, then I would have basically a bigger budget for micronutrients, because I now eat also micronutrients 1.5 times the amount compared to the 2000 calories, which then comparing winter to summer. In winter I can do a little bit more cold exposure compared to summer, where the additional heat actually gives my body heat, so my body cannot use an increase in temperature to basically blow off additional calories that I otherwise would eat, which puts the body in a probably more stressed mode, but also probably means that then I might eat less, which might mean less protein, or I can actually only eat so much then, because I cannot blow off these extra calories, which are then inefficient calories. Now, of course, if you had the ideal nutrition, that with every single calorie you would get the ideal proportions of all the different macro and micronutrients, then this would be the ideal thing, but you're probably only approaching this, even though sometimes you might not be approaching this at all. Now, let's go back to the training status. So what you are seeing here is that also recently I have not been progressing actually. So this is progressing, the green zone, this is maintaining, the yellow zone, and this is recovery even. And now if we take a look at the last year, then it also shows you a picture that is actually not that, so if it actually would show it, that would be also useful. Garmin. So it took quite some time to load. Now, these are basically all the data points. I think now every single data point is, so if we go from June, for example, to July, then there are 4 data points, which are usually my 4 weekly runs. Now, sometimes, for example, last week I ran additionally on Wednesday evening, but I noticed this because on Thursday in the morning, where I did my 40 minutes of air biking, I basically had hit multiple balls where I did not perform as well as I performed on average in the last weeks. Now, this is now again the Vo2 Max. My HRV seems to also be going up and down, but mostly my HRV seems to be not that good, or not that high rather. Now, this probably is mostly just an individual thing where my HRV just doesn't get over 100, or I don't know, but you often see these. I saw a few screenshots from other athletes, not that I am an athlete, but from other people who also post fitness data online, where they had a significantly higher HRV and not HRV ranges of maybe 30 to 60. Now, the acute training load, and this is now something that shows the progress over time quite well, I think. My body basically at one point in time here was only able to handle the load, and the optimal range Garmin determined of around, I don't know, 350 to 700 in this range here. And then the actual load is the green, not the green. The green is the optimal range, and the other thing is the load that I actually had. Now recently I have been dropping the load quite heavily, and this is mostly due to the fact that here, so for the last months before, I commuted every single day with the bike an additional 5 kilometers on average, which means also additional 20 minutes of exercise that also is recorded in Garmin. And so now it has been dropping, and I have been looking how I can basically exchange this for something that would be similar. But I do now have that's maybe something I mention afterwards. And here you can also say the heat acclimation that went up to almost 50 or almost 60% in last summer. So it began around here, so it also began to become warmer. It would be interesting to see, for example, temperature, average outdoor temperature, for example, or a metric that makes sense and that shows the average outdoor temperature over time. And in here to maybe also compare it to Vo2 Max and also to HRV, as it probably, for my body at least, seems to be an additional stressor. Now, the question is if there are additional variables that might make sense. So I already mentioned the creatine intake. It now is, as of beginning of January, it is again on first. I first think took again 5 grams, and now I'm at 10 grams again. And now my Vo2 Max is increasing. And what I also have to mention, so this now is the creatine variable. Now, omega-3 fatty acids is also a supplement I'm taking, but I don't think that they have a big impact on Vo2 Max. They might have an accumulative benefit where I might be mentally performing better, but I actually am not able to perceive it in any way. But there are studies, and so there is a study. I recently heard this headline that deficiency in omega-3 fatty acids seems to be worse than basically the risk of smoking if you are a normal smoker compared to having low omega-3 fatty acid levels. Now, I don't know what my omega-3 fatty acid levels are, but I nonetheless take 2 grams of EPA as recommended by Andrew Huberman. Now, the next variable I want to take a look at is sleep. And with sleep, I have to say that I made a big change. And now this also seems to be, or it seems that it could be partially at least responsible for the increase to now 56 and also to 57, which happened within now the last months. Now, I don't think it would be a total coincidence, but I basically am now trying to get 8 hours of sleep during the night. Now, I additionally nap during the day multiple times, but before I try to get usually 6 hours of sleep during the night, and then I would nap once, maybe for anywhere from 20 to maybe sometimes 90 minutes during the day. And now this obviously, as it changes over time, so from one day to the next, would then also impact my circadian rhythm, which meant that at my bedtime then I sometimes would not be able to sleep, which also meant that during my bedtime, or during the time at which I stay in bed or try to get sleep, I often would be awake. So basically what I have been trying to do is trying to optimize my circadian rhythm. Now, I also for multiple months, also almost years already, have been optimizing my light exposure, my sunlight exposure, also often discussed on Andrew Huberman's podcast by Andrew Huberman himself. So what I usually do now is I drive to the gym in the morning, so I already get some sunlight in. Now, this is only true for when the sunlight is actually already there in the morning, because I don't think it makes that much sense to adapt your schedule to basically the sun hours over a year. Because in winter, if I get out at my time, then often there is no sunlight, which means maybe there might be sunlight out if I go back from the gym or I come back from a run. But often there is no sunlight, which then means I have to do something else in order to get sunlight exposure. Now, I also have been tracking sunlight exposure. This was also one of the reasons I got this watch, which is the 7S Pro, which has a solar ring. So the somewhat purplish orange ring you see around this is a solar ring. Now, the watch has the ability to charge through this solar ring, and so the power it generates, I think it is measured. And so as you go out into the sun, the sunlight intensity is basically approximated by this. Now, it's not the sunlight intensity that hits your eyes, which would be ideal, but unless you wear contact lenses with light sensors in it, or rather light intensity sensors in it, or you could also say brightness sensors in it, it would be very difficult to track this, I would say. So you could approximate this basically by getting something like this on your wrist. Now, your wrist also has to be exposed. So what I try to do with exposing this is mostly that whenever I wear a shirt or a jacket, I just I just roll it back up until the point where all of this is exposed, which then means it properly is tracking my light exposure. Now, I also have been taking a look at my light exposure every now and then, and somewhat trying to teach my brain basically to model the light exposure. So if I take a look at these metrics again and again, and I associate it with the different activities I actually did, which would be in sun, then over time my brain might be able to predict basically the lux hours it gives me. So this, for example, is of today, as of today's morning run. The sun already was out, but it only was a short run, so it gave me 2.4K lux hours. In the last 6 hours is always the graph here. Now, there is not a long-term graph, I think, as of now with light intensity in Garmin, but at least it also is not called sun exposure or something like this, because it is somewhat different. It is on your wrist, and it is not the sun exposure that hits your eyes, which seems to be the thing that is most important, but also it might hit your skin, and this would also be important. And this also is then somewhat interesting. This is the average for a given week, which is also not that high, 2.6K. I actually did a hike as of a couple of weeks ago, and then the daily lux hours increased to, I think, 27K, and that's then almost 10 times as much as I got, 10 times as much light as I got as of today. Now, I try to sleep I also try to sleep in a more circadian rhythm, which means going to bed at 8. Before I went to bed at midnight and stood up at 6. Now I'm going to bed at 10 and I stand up at 6. I also try to go up immediately. I also try to hit almost the exact minute of going to bed at this specific time. I also optimized my lighting situation here. So there are like several projects that I think compounded maybe in this. And of course, now if something optimizes my circadian rhythm, which then might optimize my sleep, then it might optimize my performance. If my performance is optimized in these workouts, then over time there might be a compounding effect. If I then additionally am able to perform better with taking creatine, and so on and so forth. So there might be these different variables influencing each other. And if I am able to perform better, then I might burn more calories, which at a given caloric intake, or if I have a given caloric intake, then this means that basically I have less additional calories that my body doesn't use, and if I can actually eat more, if my body wants more food and I then eat more, then I again have a bigger budget for micronutrients, which then also means probably that my performance is better, because then my body has just more micronutrients, and if it doesn't need them, it can still get them out of the system again. Now, this only might be true for certain macronutrients, for certain vitamins. Other ones might not be as easily excretable. Now, we discussed sleep and we discussed regeneration. What I did for sleep is actually a couple of things. I also tried to get a cooling mattress, which seems to have an increase in sleep score. But mostly what I did is I just said, okay, what if the vector of sleep score, so the vector that points to a higher sleep score, is fairly similar to the vector that is actually better quality sleep. So I just got rid of basically my subjective judgment of my sleep. I often also would wake up with a high sleep score, and I would not feel like it. I would feel not that great, and I also would perform not that great during the workout. But so there might not be a very good correlation in between how you feel in the morning, for example, compared to the sleep score. This is also part of the reason why I still don't really trust. It's not trusting these sleep scores. I just don't think they are that accurate. Also, Garmin had this issue on my 6S Pro, this is now the 7S Pro of the Phoenix line, that it would not record parts of my sleep. This is now a little bit better. Also, I think mostly because I switched to this strap. So there are these small things like switching the actual strap that Garmin sends this watch with, and I switched it to this strap of the Galaxy Watch because I had two from the Galaxy Watch, which also means I have the exact same straps. Now the watches obviously are a little bit different in terms of the build, and also this might affect the positioning of the watch, but I try to wear them as tight as I can, and then basically at least I have the same strap, and therefore the sleep score is somewhat comparable. I have the sleep score now on my Galaxy Watch 4 and also on this year. And on this year, on the Garmin, it is usually 10 to 20 points lower. This seems to be kind of the average. It could also be that this year sometimes shows a higher sleep score compared to this one. But usually, or no, often it is that this watch records a little bit less sleep compared to this watch, which also records. Now, in the past, I also have to say that the Galaxy Watch already recorded naps during the day. I don't know where the threshold is, but once you are awake, once you have been unconscious, kind of, unless you were lucid dreaming, but I don't think lucid dreaming affects the sleep scores, then it probably records something. But I don't know if the Galaxy Watch, for example, already records 1 minute. It seems to be that it's maybe 10 to 20 minutes what the threshold is for basically recording a nap, which then also is accounted in the overall sleep duration, but it doesn't affect the sleep score. The only thing that affects the sleep score is the night sleep, so the big sleep you have at night. It is the same for the Garmin. The Garmin does show you, or does the sleep score on the Garmin is only affected by the night sleep. Now, if you sleep additionally in the day, the Garmin actually recently introduced, and I think this is not available on older watches, only on newer ones such as the 7S Pro. It also now shows you the naps. It auto records the naps once you are asleep. You can also manually record them and therefore also record naps where you aren't asleep, which I did for quite some time. And I've been experimenting with this, also experimenting with the nap feature of then waking you up after maybe 10 minutes, for example. But I just saw this eventually as once I tested this, I just saw this as an additional step increase, so task increase. So every time I've scheduled a nap, I would have to then go into this watch and then start the nap. Whereas if I actually want to align my circadian rhythm, mostly with the exact time as best I possibly can, so I would have a 24-hour cycle and I try to basically hit exactly the times, then I would go to bed exactly at 10 p.m. for example, and I would get up exactly at 6 a.m. and the naps also would be basically from anywhere from 10, where the 10 minutes starts, usually at 50 minutes into an hour, and then I would wake up again for the full hour, or not wake up because I usually am not asleep. But it seems to be the case that then my mental performance and also my average productivity seems to be increased, which is the reason I then do this a few times during the day. So now this is a short summary. I think I mentioned the main variables. I also take curcumin, as I already mentioned, but I think curcumin might have a negative impact on my performance. So maybe I do think that without curcumin there is a somewhat noticeable effect that I can perform better in the gym. But this might only be once I basically take off curcumin, and there might still be kind of so curcumin seems to suppress basically my peak performance to some extent, I think, and at the same time it suppresses my immune system up to a point where I can actually breathe through my nose on average, whereas without taking the turmeric or curcumin capsules I am usually not able to breathe through my nose. Also in winter, if I for example go on a bike ride and I'm trying to lock in my bike, then I usually have to bow down in order to read the numbers, the digits on my bike lock, and this is when already my nose begins to so I basically have to not sneeze but to blow my nose already, because otherwise it would drop onto the floor, which is an example of what my immune system does on a baseline level. Now this also could be that there are some things in my environment which I could optimize where this doesn't then occur, but it seems to be the case that if I take turmeric, then my nose is basically a little bit freer or less congested, and I then am able to probably sleep better. I also probably am accessing slightly different mental states because of the effect of mouth breathing and nose breathing on multiple things on the body. But I then have the side effect of turmeric probably decreasing DHT, which is also something Andrew Huberman, for example, talks about. Now not DHT, but turmeric is also taken by a few people for longevity purposes, but I think mostly for me the main effect is that it suppresses my immune system up to the point where my nose is not congested all the time. I additionally then in summer have pollen allergy sometimes not so much. It depends on the seasons, and it depends on when these certain grasses and flowers actually blossom. But so in the last years, for example, I had not that many issues. But of course this then affects my training, and this is also what I assume that actually prohibited me maybe in the past. So I grew up on the countryside, and there were, especially in summer, it would get increasingly difficult to actually run outside. And since running was my main cardiovascular workout, because I ran every second day, and then I layered things on top of this, such as swimming, but I alternated in between strength training and running from the age of around 12. And so the hypothesis I have is that I just couldn't accumulate basically a compound effect. I couldn't accumulate, it's kind of doubled here. I couldn't compound enough exercise over time, so I couldn't tap into actually compound effects that much. And this might be the reason why I'm still comparably low in also my Vo2 Max and also my cardiovascular ability. I still, if I'm hiking with someone who would be reasonably trained, then I would still be lagging usually behind. So I had a few friends, for example, who I went on a skiing tour once, and it was, I don't want to say it was a disaster, but one skiing tour like this was a disaster, at least probably out of the eyes of the other person, because I just couldn't hold it up at all. Now there also might be the reasoning that I did a 48-hour fast before this, and I try to still hold on to this idea that you could just train faster and perform as well as you could otherwise, but it just probably is not true. At least it is not true for me. I'm probably not able to train up my fat burning up to the point where it is then equal to aerobic burning of energy, mostly then glycogen. Now, this is just something I wanted to mention. A Vo2 Max of 57 for me is probably also still on the lower side. Now, what I also could show you is Inside Tracker, which also gives me a Vo2 Max range, and it also shows me an optimal range. It imports the Vo2 Max I get from Garmin and then takes it into account in a few of its health dashboards. So now we switch over to Inside Tracker, which is now the app on the phone, but I have it on my notebook here. Now, we see also that these were my liver values, which were quite high, which was kind of the medical issue I told you about. Now, if we click to inner age, then we also see that my inner age is quite high, mostly due to, I think, these liver values. Now, if we go into activity, this is the actual category I wanted to show you. Now, it shows you also the deep sleep, REM sleep, sleep duration, and steps count. These are all things that are imported from Garmin. But what is somewhat interesting, I would say, is that it shows you the different categories of sleep as an individual metric, whereas in Garmin you just have the overall sleep score. And it also shows you these ranges. So my deep sleep, for example, is on the lower side. But now this is from March 24th, 2024, but you can also view the history and then see whether your deep sleep on average is in the average range or in the optimal range. So on Monday, for example, it was, but then during the last day it was not. Now this is now just this week. There could be things happening, there could be things happening that are not happening. So if we then switch to a year, then this is where it starts to get really interesting, I think. So you can see that, for example, here I peaked in deep sleep, and it was way above the optimal range, which I don't know why this would be the case. Now I don't know how much one single strike like this actually would be. Is it then just a day, or is it multiple days or a week? It probably is each and every. So if we take here from September to October, there are probably about 30 strikes in between there, not just 4. So it is probably just a single day. But this paints a picture, and this paints a picture that I now can better assess or maybe take into account into future considerations, such as maybe not trying to sleep 6 hours a night only in terms of sleep any longer. Now, you get also these correlations of what your blood says, for example, and in this case my cholesterol was also somewhat on the higher range of the normal, and this is now correlated with deep sleep. I don't know specifically whether total cholesterol is related with deep sleep. I don't know whether glucose, for example, this is now fasting glucose, that also was included in the blood test I did, would be correlated with deep sleep. But by, for example, taking into account these different variables, I then can say, okay, how many sleep cycles did I have? How likely is it that deep sleep occurs? When does deep sleep actually occur? And so on and so forth. So by getting more information, that's what I'm trying to say, I'm able to, at least in theory, then make better judgments, even though this all seems to be fairly complicated. And therefore, I'm also grateful that things like this, like Garmin and Insight Tracker, that they exist and that I just can be on the other end as the user. Now, this is also now on the... This was before, it was like here. And this is also what gives you a perspective, I think. Before I thought, okay, if I increase my VO2 max to 55, I mean, if you just take a look at, if you just Google high VO2 max Garmin, then you see a couple of screenshots of people who have 55, 56, some people have 60, some people even have 65, but that's already the higher end of the range. So the top athletes, so the world record for VO2 max is, I think, almost close to 100. And this is, I think, it was a Swedish, maybe he wasn't Swedish, but it was a cross-country skier who trained a bit, and he apparently had a highly increasable VO2 max, and then he didn't train. He also took part in, I think, a few competitions, maybe also Olympia, I don't know exactly. So now you just see all these different variables, basically in this case blood markers, that are correlated with VO2 max. So for example, if I had very high triglycerides, by getting them down in some way or another, I could then maybe optimize my VO2 max further. And this just shows so much, because I just couldn't come up with something like this. If I have a specific metric, it shows the other things that are related to this. And in regards to some of these, it even then shows me specific studies, which then I can look up. So it is, I probably had to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours, and this is now not, I probably would have to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours, similarly with Samsung Health in the past, similarly with Garmin Connect, to come up with something like this. I tried to make some Excel spreadsheets and so on and so forth. Now, back to this graph here. I was basically just in the optimized zone with a VO2 max of 56. A VO2 max of 86 would still be optimized for me, 86. And if we, for example, it previously I think showed that 55 or 54 here was the threshold for optimized, which means I am nowhere near the middle of my optimized zone, and I'm nowhere near 86. 86 is still almost double. Now, of course, it's not exactly double, but 57, I mean, of course, if I double it, it's almost over 100, not almost, but it would be 114. But still, 86 is just so far away. But if I would be able, for example, to increase my VO2 max on average for now the next years or the next months, so let's say in 1 year's time it would be increased by another 6 points to 63. Then in next year's time, another year, then we would have 69. And then another year 75, and another year then it would be at 81, and then another year it would be at 87. And so this would be, I know this counted or miscounted, I think, but it would be 5 or 6 years of continuous, probably 5 years of continuous training to get to the higher end of my optimized zone. But I'm also already aging. So as I'm already aging, this might be harder and harder to, so basically the first derivative might be harder and harder, because I probably will not be able to maintain this this progress I'm currently making with maybe about to an increase in VO2 max of about 1 in every 2 months. Now, I also want to show you an additional thing, which is the supplement side. So it actually recommended ashwagandha to me, and I previously was not aware that ashwagandha would also increase VO2 max potentially. Now it said it somewhere here, and I also had it somewhere here. Now it just shows me all of it, but ashwagandha either disappeared. No, it is still here, but it is on the lower side, and it was not marked by me because I'm currently not taking it. So ashwagandha, I think, needs to be cycled, at least from what I heard on the Huberman podcast. Now, it has these different things. It also might show you your DNA if you have it in here. So your DNA says you are highly trainable in terms of Vo2 Max, for example. Start taking an ashwagandha supplement. Why then? And somewhere in here we find that it is also... No, that is the wrong thing. What your body says is Vo2 Max of 56.3, which is now also nice because I did not have the 0.3 in here anywhere else. It also doesn't show it anywhere else. And now it looks like Inside Tracker was closed. So to the team at Inside Tracker, maybe just don't make your app load for 20 seconds. I do have a maybe slightly older phone, a Galaxy S10, which came out in 2019, which is 5 years ago, but still. The app takes seconds to load, so I again paused in between. So now if we switch back to my results and the action plan, then we go into edit action plan, and then we again search for ashwagandha, and then maybe it works that we can click on this link. Now it also mentions all of these other things. I, for example, made a meal shake where I included all the different food recommendations. And now if we go on ashwagandha and what your body says, then you could... It just crashed again. I don't know why this is the case, but it showed me yesterday that it potentially would increase Vo2 Max if I begin taking ashwagandha. I don't know if I now should take it, and also it's an increased cost to basically what I invest in terms of health. Finally, maybe an outlook into the future. Now, of course, now the question is, should I maybe take 25 grams of creatine if creatine has such a good impact, and there seems to be also no side effects, or not that many side effects, to taking higher doses of creatine. Now, should I maybe take ashwagandha? Should I maybe run 3 times a week? But previously, as I basically had maybe a little bit of more exercise in my week, it often seemed to be the case that then during a run, for example, during my weekly run, I was not able to perform that well because I just wasn't regenerated enough to perform somewhat optimally, and then also to increase my Vo2 Max again. It's not that my Vo2 Max then maybe actually increases, it's just that I need to get this weekly measurement done. My run is the weekly measurement of my running Vo2 Max, and if I'm not regenerated, and if my sleep, for example, was just 5% worse compared to what it could have been, then it probably means that over time, the compound effect of increasing my Vo2 Max, in this regard, just as one metric, is probably worse compared to maybe 5% higher. And also, if you think about 1%, and you think about 365 days and what 1% only, an increase of 1% could do to your performance, to the accumulating metrics such as your 1 rep max in terms of strength training, or your Vo2 Max over time. And now, also, if I think about the bigger time frame of my life, then if I don't increase my Vo2 Max now up to the point where it would be then high enough such that it then can drop by maybe a couple of points every year, or I don't know what exactly the decline of Vo2 Max looks like. But if you, I think, reach a Vo2 Max of 30 to 25, then your ability to walk, to do simple things like shopping groceries is basically even prohibited. Peter Attia, in his book, but also in his book Outlive, but also on his blog and his podcast, talks often about the centenarian decathlon. And a decathlon is basically a set of exercises that is 10 exercises. And there are basically these 10 things that you can think of yourself that you want to be doing at a high age. And then if you still want to be doing the things, then you can look up what Vo2 Max you need for these specific things, like walking up the stairs with a bag of groceries, like putting your travel bag into the airplane thing. And so if you then want to do this, and then you can calculate your Vo2 Max decline, that is, you just take the average maybe, and then you kind of have to go back to where your Vo2 Max would have to be now, such that with maybe 70, you would still be able to walk upstairs, and maybe to carry your grandchild that is then maybe 5 kilogram heavy, or maybe it's already an older child and then it's heavier. So it's one, I think, no. So maybe I just want to end with this one note and just make this very simple. I could make up this calculation, and then if my Vo2 Max was like this and like this and like this. But again, relying on something like Garmin to tell me just my fitness age is 18.5, for example, and maybe Garmin would also include metrics like Vo2 Max in its fitness calculation. It might already do. Now, because Garmin is kind of a more continuously measured thing compared to Inside Tracker, which I only can get blood drawn probably once a year, and to update the diet recommendations, but also the other recommendations, it seems to me that Garmin, so kind of betting on Garmin's fitness age to improve and to be a fitness age that I can rely on, in addition to the eGym age, fitness age I already am using, which currently shows me I'm 33 or something like this, also 5 years higher than my actual age. But simplifying it down to maybe a single number and maybe using heuristics or simplifying algorithms, you could also say, in this case, would result in the following. Maybe I just say, okay, with a Vo2 Max increase of 1, I can get an additional 45 days of lifespan. On average, of course, and that it's just association, and this does not mean that it is caused by me, but if I actually have a Vo2 Max that is 1 point higher, then this does not mean that I live actually 45 days longer. It could also be that I live less and get hit by a bus, for example. But it is just an average, so I can just calculate with kind of the average numbers. So 45 days. So if my Vo2 Max increases every 2 months by 45 days, then I almost get back the 2 months by having this. Now I could also say, okay, 45 days. So every 6 weeks, at least as of now, as I'm still in a somewhat capable health state, my Vo2 Max has to increase by 1 point every 6 weeks, such that I am basically having escape velocity. And now escape velocity is the concept that basically you extend your health more than time takes away from your health. So over a given year, you would, for example, age 1 year chronologically. But if you don't age biologically for 1 year, then you not only, then, now, this is not, So if you take, let's say 1 year, and you would biologically age less than this 1 year. Now, I don't know if this is then already reaching escape velocity, but basically escape velocity would be a time where, for example, technology or something else would give you more health and then also time back than time is actually getting health from you. So if you don't age biologically for a given year, I don't know if the biological age concept, how this relates then to the escape velocity. If I then have something like this, maybe Vo2 Max escape velocity at least, then, so I already kind of know what this needs to be. I think it needs to be 6 weeks. If I basically every 45 days increase my Vo2 Max by 1 point, then in terms of Vo2 Max, I'm basically fleeing death using Vo2 Max as a metric that predicts my lifespan and therefore also death. And by increasing my Vo2 Max every 6 weeks, I would basically have the possibility, at least in theory and on average and statistically speaking, that I would not age in terms of Vo2 Max. And not only not age, but I would actually increase my... No, I wouldn't increase, because it would still eventually go away, this Vo2 Max. I would still die, probably. I don't know what the different effects of this would be. Now, I want to mention maybe 2 other simplification algorithms. And the bigger concept behind this was that I wanted a biological clock on my wrist. So now you have time on your wrist. But the question is not so much how much time there is left, but much more how much health there is left. So if then you only have a certain amount of health left, then as health decreases, now it's not that health decreases, it seems to me that as time goes on, health decreases because time goes on. Now, this could be due to a variety of processes, but so the idea was that I would have a clock on my wrist that would tell me how long I would be still able to live. So basically, it would not be time as of here, which is just the time of the day, but it would be the time I still have left. So the actual time, that is at least my time. And of course, the time I have left is mostly correlated then to the health that I still have. If I'm 80 and I am healthier than I am now, if I'm 80 chronologically, then I'm healthier than I am now, which would mean that I'm probably biologically younger even than I am now. Then this should also be reflected on here. And ideally, it would maybe also translate into weeks and hours. So you could, for example, take your average. So you could take the average of basically your death prediction. So you would say, okay, it's up until 75, for example, that you probably are likely to live, and then you could calculate your death day, and then you could go backwards from there and maybe in the future get a widget like this, or maybe there is already a widget like this where you can have this. On the phone, for example, I have a widget that is a clock, and I have basically the clock ticking down. You can even get this with seconds, but this then draws from your phone battery a little bit. So now what I have on my watch here is first of all my average resting heart rate for the last 7 days. I have to cover my face because otherwise it doesn't show you. So my resting heart rate for the last 7 days average was 53. It already was as low as on the previous watch, on the Phoenix 6S Pro. It already was as low as 41, and now it's 53. So in terms of this, basically in terms of resting heart rate. Now, not in terms of resting heart rate. There is a formula which goes for maximum heart rate, and the maximum heart rate seems to decrease with 1 point every year. So you take 220 and you deduct your age, and this is then probably your maximum heart rate you're still able to achieve. If you then have a higher maximum heart rate still, and you do a sprint session somewhere, or you try to get your max rate not your max rate, but your heart rate as high as you possibly can, and you still have a higher maximum heart rate, then this means, at least in terms of maximum heart rate, you would still be biologically younger. Now, on the other side is now Vo2 Max. This is a Garmin watch face that is called Glance Pro Dual. So I previously had the Glance Pro, but it didn't show the Vo2 Max. I actually wrote Garmin, I think even multiple times, that they should give these third-party developers of watch faces access, because I previously asked the developer of this watch face why Vo2 Max, for example, was not on there, and why other metrics like load were not on there or were not available for display. So I wrote Garmin, and actually now it is available. Garmin Vo2 Max is available for third-party developers, and they can now have it on the watch, and now it actually shows me 57. Now, I did think about these two metrics, and these seem to be mostly measurable. So these are metrics that one can easily estimate or measure with a fitness tracker like this, without basically an expensive laboratory measurement of your body fat, but also maybe your Vo2 Max in a laboratory. Now, one could now create two simplification rules, even though they might not be very accurate. The first one would be that, so first of all, the lower the resting heart rate over the last 7 days, the better it is in terms of longevity, it seems to be. Athletes typically have lower resting heart rate, which also means they have a better trained cardiovascular system, and so on and so forth. In terms of Vo2 Max, it would be the other way around. So with a higher Vo2 Max comes higher longevity, or increased longevity. So now what I could do is, I could say the 57 are the years I will live in total. Now, this should not be the years I have left. Why? Because at a Vo2 Max of 25, for example, people seem to be kind of dying because they cannot do anything at all any longer. It's not specifically Vo2 Max of 25, but Peter Thiel mentioned 25 to 30 for maybe a woman of this age and of this height, and so on and so forth. So of course specifics, but the question for me now is, should I take this as the maximum, as basically the maximum age I will reach, or should I take this as something else? So for example, what I could do is assume that this is my age at which I die. Or I could assume that these are the years I have left to live. So the difference is that I then have to deduct either my current chronological age or not. So now, if I, for example, would be able to have a Vo2 Max of 83, then I think it makes more sense to be more conservative and to go with okay, this is the years I have in total to live, and I deduct my current age, which means, as of current, I would have 20 years left to live. Now, is this a nice result? It doesn't really matter, because what matters is that it is somewhat accurate, ideally, but also the incentives it gives me back, kind of. So I can basically now, with the Vo2 Max of 57, just say, okay, 20 years left to live. If I instead would have been putting in way more work, or what I would already by some way would have been able to basically get my health up to a better point, and not only health in terms of VO2 max, but also in terms of other things, then I might already have a VO2 max of 60, of maybe 65, of 70, as of now. And so therefore I would have basically more time left to live. Now, if you don't have access to a VO2 max estimate, or you don't go running once a week or cycling with a smart cycling device, then one could take resting heart rate. And if one now takes resting heart rate, then one has to account for the fact that this is now a correlation that is basically the opposite. I don't know what the specific word for this is, but if you basically can account for this by taking, for example, 100 and then deducting the number, which then means that the rest that is left is basically the thing that would be the age you're still, or the years. So it could be the age or the years. If we take 100, and I think 100 is a reasonable number. Also, if you have a resting heart rate of 100, then probably your health is in a bad state. So by taking 100 and making up, maybe it's 110, that would be more ideal in terms of this rule. And this is also maybe why VO2 max is a better number, because it already is the number. It already is kind of the years, and you only have to deduct your age. Whereas with resting heart rate, you then would take 100. In my case, it would be now 53 years. I would have to deduct, not years I have to deduct, but I just deduct the resting heart rate. I would then have 47. And then with the 47, this would be again the years I have left to live. So it would not be 20 years I have left to live, but in terms of my resting heart rate, it would only be 10. Now the question also is on these different points in the graph, how does it correlate actually, or is associated with longevity? I don't really know. This is just a simplification rule I made up in order to have kind of a biological clock of my health on my wrist. And it seems to be that VO2 max and also resting heart rate seem to be the two most important predictors of health, resting heart rate and also VO2 max. So I now have them on my watch, and ideally they would incentivize me towards doing something for this. So this also brings a different framing, I think, to a question of, for example, should I now take ashwagandha? What would be, I could take it and it would have not an effect. I could take it and I get sick and I die by it, but that's not very likely. At least it doesn't seem to be very likely. So if I, for example, can bring down the time of basically getting to the next VO2 max point, then if I can bring this down, then I maybe might not take 5 or 6 years until I reach the upper end, and I only have a couple of years left probably where I can. So basically, I'm already working against my aging, and so I probably should do anything that is in my control to try to basically get my VO2 max as high as I possibly can, and also my overall health, and also my resistance training, and also my muscle mass, as long as I still can. If I, for example, have to have, I don't know, if I have a serious medical issue and I have to get, I don't know, a joint replaced, for example, and I then can't train for multiple weeks or maybe even months as I otherwise would, then it probably, I mean, based on something like this, it probably will take me years, if not a decade, to get back to a state like this. And of course, I then would again be working against aging. So it is just very, actually, one could simplify this again. If I, on the one side, would have something like that, something that takes me out for 2 months, or I just cannot, I have an issue with my knee, for example, and I cannot hit 3 runs in a year, then these 3 runs are missing. I will never be able to make them back. And the same is true for every single other thing. Every single night of sleep that I have until basically death is, if I have a less quality of sleep, and this goes for all other areas of life as well. I'm only talking about health and fitness because this channel is obviously about health and fitness. But every single thing that doesn't happen, has never a chance to happen again. So if something takes me out for 4 weeks, if I get the flu, if I get something like COVID, then this might mean that there are 2 months not only lost of progress, but I'm also losing the trajectory I'm on, and it might be flattening, and my VO2 max might regress. If my VO2 max, for example, regresses, then this would be, if my VO2 max regresses to 50 again, this would be a very likely scenario. It was only a couple of months ago, basically a a year ago. Last March or last April, I think it was 50 or 51. So regressing up until this point would mean that I would lose 45 multiplied by in this case now 6. Or if we just say the 50 and do 57 minus the 50 would be a 7 point difference, and the 7 point difference multiplied by 45 days would equate to 315 days. So with the simplification rule of 45 days for every 1 point increase in Vo2 Max, I would have lost 315 days of my life. This again makes it, I think, very concrete.